Well, good morning, everyone. It is Tuesday morning, and this is our second to last Bible study that is on the book of Revelation, live streaming from the campus of God's Bible School and College, and coming to you on YouTube and Facebook. Notice, if you would, there on the screen that the YouTube videos are all in a playlist for you on the GBSC YouTube page. They also are on the GBSC Facebook, and so you can get access to those. It's still not too late, even though this is our final week of the study. Homework can be submitted for another month through the end of June. So if you're joining us late and you would like to get some college credit, you have some time in June to do the homework, you're welcome to do that. Once again, I'll say more about this on Thursday on our last session, but thank you to Rachel Pohl for helping out behind the scenes, making sure things are working smoothly, sending emails out, and that kind of, and watching for questions. We're talking about what the last book says about living in the last days. And today we come to a fascinating passage in Revelation chapter 20. It's also heavily debated. And so I decided for this Bible study to focus mainly on Revelation chapter 20 and save Revelation 21 and 22 for the final session on Thursday. So we'll look forward to that on Thursday, getting to the new heavens and the new earth. Again, we're using the textbook commentary by Grant Osborne, and I hope several of you have been able to purchase that and have been enjoying it. Remember, the Revelation is the kind of book, really, any Bible study, if any book of Scripture, is helpful to have a good commentary. But I think for books like Revelation and Daniel, it's especially important to have a good commentary because there's so much background imagery, historical information, things like that, that most of us are not familiar with when it comes to studying apocalyptic literature and prophetic literature. And so it's very beneficial to have a commentary like Osborne. So hopefully you're taking advantage of that. Also, I recommend Teach the Text commentary series, Revelation volume by J. Scott Duvall. That's another very helpful, accessible commentary. Very interesting, lots of pictures, lots of graphs, and easy to follow. And then finally, if you haven't purchased yet this dictionary of biblical prophecy and end times, republished as an A to Z guide to biblical prophecy and end times, I recommend that you get that. And just about any term in eschatology or in studying Revelation that you come across, you can go to this dictionary and get a nice overview of the discussion of that term. I find it very helpful. Just to review briefly what we looked at last week on Thursday, we looked at Revelation 19, which was the second coming of Jesus Christ, which means that after all this time in the book of Revelation, building up to the point of the return of Jesus, Revelation 19 finally describes that. The marriage supper of the Lamb in wonderful praise, and then the return of the King of Kings, and along with his return, that great battle. Back in Revelation 16, it was called the Battle of Armageddon. In Revelation 17, it was described as the battle in which the Lamb is victorious over his foes, and with the Lamb are those who are called faithful, true, the army that comes with him. We talked about that being composed of both angels, the angelic host, and of the saints. And that is followed then by the great supper of God and the aftermath of the battle. And I put battle in quotation marks there because there's really no battle. Very quickly, the evil Antichrist and the false prophet, the beast from the sea, are overcome. I see a question here from YouTube on where you can purchase the dictionary I just put on the screen. Probably the easiest place to purchase that is on Amazon. If you just go to Amazon.com and do a search for that title, you should be able to find that. And I think it costs maybe $10 if you buy the ebook version of it, which I like ebooks. But if you want the paper copy, paperback or hardcover, those are also available. So the Great Supper of God and the aftermath of the battle, in a sense, it feels like as you go through the narrative of Revelation that there's a bit of a pause because we're introduced to the marriage supper of the Lamb. We're told about it and we're invited to it. But then before we get to that, we have the return of the King and the Great Supper of God and then the millennial period. Then when we get back into Revelation 21, once again, John is taken in the Spirit and he sees this magnificent woman, the bride of the Lamb. So I'm going to talk here in a few minutes about the chronological sequence of these end time events, the way that I see them related. But just a reminder that as we work through a book like Revelation, there's always a couple of questions always come up. What time is it? And that is, where are we at in chronology? And are the visions in strict sequential chronological succession? Or is there some recapitulation going on, some repetition, some intensification? We talked about that with the three sets of the seals, the sevens with the seals and the trumpets and the bowls, and some of the other imagery of the visions. We also get that feeling of trying to find our way through that. And then the other question that often comes up with the imagery is this literal or is this figurative? Is the symbolism being applied to physical time and space in the normal literal way that we expect the language to work? Or is it being used more as a metaphorical word picture with figurative, interpretive relationship? And I think hopefully it's come across as we've worked through this that I think there can be a both and going on at different points. And sometimes the way that you see the imagery from the first century perspective as a preterist, or throughout time and space through church history as an idealist, or with an eye to the end times events that still have not yet come to pass as a futurist, you can read the imagery of the book and gain help from each of those three perspectives. Although typically most interpreters are always, most interpreters today are taking an eclectic approach that tries to do what I just said, and that is to glean the best insights from those three major approaches. But still, each interpreter normally privileges or prioritizes one of those ways of reading the book. Grant Osborne is going to privilege or prioritize the futurist approach, which is what I tend to follow as well. And others, such as Greg Beale, are going to privilege and prioritize the idealist approach, while still not denying preterist and futurist implications. So again, just a reminder of why it's important to have good resources and why there is so much debate about the book of Revelation, because people read the exact same words in the Bible, they have the exact same view of Scripture, a high view of Scripture, and they still can disagree because they take the imagery and the visions differently, or they approach the book from different perspectives. And those presuppositions that we all have affect the way that we read the text and influence our conclusions. Also, one of the things that makes it difficult working through Revelation, thinking about eschatology, the study of last things, is it's not just the text of Revelation that we're interpreting. We also are trying to put together what is said in the book of Daniel, what is said in the Gospels, in Jesus' Olivet Discourse, what Paul says, especially in the Thessalonian epistles, along with other references in the New Testament from Peter and other places. And so all of those scriptures are having to be moved around in our minds and to slot in specific interpretation and answer certain questions. Often it's not simply what does this verse in Revelation mean by itself, it is what does this verse mean, and the way I make sense of this verse is in light of what I think about all these other verses in Daniel and the Olivet Discourse. And so that adds several other layers of interpretive complexity. But hopefully for us as students of God's Word, that just means that we get to spend more time doing one of our favorite things, and that is reading the Bible and listening to God's Word and trying to understand it to the best of our ability. So hopefully it's a fun journey for you. It certainly has been for me over the years that God has allowed me to study this book and these topics. But also I hope that it gives us a little bit of interpretive humility. If you're going to be an interpreter of Revelation, please don't do that unless you have some interpretive humility. And what I mean by that is you're looking at opposing viewpoints, you're realizing where there's ambiguity and there's things that you can't know for certain or it's hard to say for certain, and you're willing to admit that and to be honest about what the evidence says. So hopefully those are all things that I tried to model that in this study as we work through the book, and hopefully that's something all of us will do as we read the book and study it. Now as we go into chapter 20, this is an exciting chapter, but it's also, as I said, a complex chapter. And so we'll work through some of these issues here and hopefully focus on the big picture and the theological message of Revelation chapter 20. So we have here in the first three verses, the binding of Satan, verses 4 to 7, the 1,000-year reign of Christ and the saints who are reigning with Christ. And then in verses 8 to 10, the final battle. And in verses 11 to 15, the great white throne judgment. So, going into the text now for the binding of Satan. John says, "Then I saw," and by the way, those of us who read the book from a premillennial and a futurist orientation are, especially in this part of Revelation with chapter 19 going into chapter 20 into 21, we're trying to pay careful attention to the text and the chronological indicators. Now, hopefully everyone reading the book is trying to do that, but the point is that an all-millennial interpreter who takes a more symbolic approach will often not see the narrative sequence and the chronology of the text as being as important or as decisive. So they would perhaps see repetition, and the battle of chapter 20 with Satan in verses 7 to 10 would be the same battle as chapter 19 with the rider on the white horse, which is the same battle as chapter 16. When I see chronological indicators, though, such as this word right here, "then I saw," it does tell me that this is a reference to how John is experiencing the visions, the sequence that he has as he is seeing this thing happen and then that thing happen. So just because there's a chronological or narrative sequence in the visions does not necessarily mean that in time and space there's the same chronology going on. For instance, I can tell a story about something that happened at one point, and then I can switch and tell it from a different angle, and I might use language that seems to follow one thing after the other, but you could understand that I'm telling the same event from two different angles. So John could be doing that, but here I would read this chapter 20 as definitely being the next chronological thing after chapter 19. I do see a question here from Facebook. Can we keep writing you questions through June? The answer is certainly. You feel free to send me comments, questions that you have, and especially now that the semester is coming to an end, I'm catching up on some of my responsibilities related to ending the semester. I'll have more time, hopefully, to get back to you on some emails. So I apologize if I haven't gotten back to you on some of the questions you've already asked in email or on Facebook, and I'll try to catch up on those. So as we move into chapter 20, verses 1 to 3, John sees an angel coming down from heaven. And this is interesting to see the contrast between the angel who is coming down, descending, versus in the previous parts of the book, we've seen a beast who has been ascending. A beast has come up out of the abyss. Here, an angel is coming down. And the angel is holding in his hand the key to the abyss, the bottomless pit, and a great chain. So he's got the key to the bottomless pit, he's got a great chain, and he's coming after the dragon. And notice how John specifies exactly who it is that he is talking about. It is the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan. So this dragon throughout the book of Revelation that back in chapter 12 was described in the battle that he has had against the people of God and against the male child who is the Messiah, Jesus Christ. Now, after the defeat of the forces of evil at the Battle of Armageddon at the end of chapter 19 when Jesus returns, there the Antichrist figure, who is the beast from the sea, and the false prophet, who is the beast from the land, both of them and their followers in the battle have been thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns forever and ever. And so they are already there, taking the narrative sequence of the visions, which I think also indicates a chronological sequence in time and space. So when we get into chapter 20, now we have the dragon who is still around. The dragon is the ancient serpent, who I see as the same figure who came into the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3 and tempted Adam and Eve and caused a sin and a curse to enter into the world, into human experience. But that ancient serpent, who is also the devil, who is Satan, he is the adversary, he is bound, and he is bound for 1,000 years. So this 1,000 years, this is the place in the Bible where this occurs. Revelation 20 is where we have this discussion of the 1,000-year period, which is the Latin for 1,000 years is millennium. So all the other places in the Bible, in the Old Testament prophecies, and other places in the book of Revelation where we talk about the millennium, interpret it, we only have this one specific passage in Revelation 20 where this actual term is used. So what happens is for premillennial futurist interpreters like myself, we want to focus on this text and talk about what it means, and it's such an important text. Other interpreters that are amillennial or postmillennial, they will also want to talk about this text, but they will want to interpret this text in light of other passages which are more um, uh, friendly towards the amillennial or the postmillennial interpretation. And that's not unique to those kinds of interpreters because all of us do the same thing. But the point is for a premillennial interpreter, especially futurist premillennial, this is one of the key passages in the entire Bible from which we want to look over other passages and see how they fit into this framework from Revelation 20. So you can kind of even see in how this passage gets interpreted, the presuppositions that we bring to the passage influence the weight or the priority that we put upon how this passage relates to other parts of the Bible. But here we have the reference to Satan being bound for 1,000 years. And notice the finality with which this binding happens. Or I say the finality, notice the completeness. He is bound, he is thrown into the pit, and the pit is shut and sealed over him. So bound, thrown, shut, sealed. You can hear that completeness of that binding that is happening to Satan here. And the reason why he is bound is so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until, and here's another reference to that term, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. So this verse 3 indicates what is going to come ahead in the narrative, and it's fulfilled in verse 7, where this releasing of Satan is described. But a couple important things I think to say here about these verses that I have on the screen, these first 3 verses of chapter 20, is that there is a reckoning that Satan is now going to deal with. And notice there's no struggle here. One angel. Now we understand that Satan himself is a fallen angel, a demonic being who's also created by God as an angelic being who chose to rebel, who has fallen. But one angel comes down, and when it's time for Satan to be bound, there's no battle here. Just as in chapter 19, when Jesus returns, it's an anticlimactic scene because you expect a great clash of warfare between the Lamb and his armies and the beast and his armies. But instead, with one word, with one word, the beast and his armies are defeated. Just as in Genesis 1, God spoke and said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God creates with a word, and when it comes down to the end, in a sense, he uncreates with a word. And what I mean by uncreates, he does away, he abolishes with a word, because when he returns on the white horse and he sees the beast and all of his armies, the sword that comes out of Jesus' mouth, that word of God, the judgment that comes from Jesus Christ, as it's spoken, it instantly accomplishes reality, brings into reality a new situation. And now there is no beast, there is no prophet, there are no armies who are arrayed against God. They have all been thrown into the lake of fire with just that moment of Jesus' victorious proclamation and assertion. So here in chapter 20, when it comes time for Satan to be bound and one angel comes down, it doesn't say that the devil fights against this angel as back in chapter 12 where the devil fought against Michael and was cast down from heaven. Remember, this is kind of the stages of the fall of Satan. He is expelled from heaven down to earth. Now he is taken from earth into the bottomless pit, the abyss. Once he is released later in chapter 20 for a brief moment of rebellion, then he will be cast into the lake of fire, his final home and his final place of torment. But here there's no battle. The angel comes, seizes the dragon, and binds him. And church, I hope this is encouraging to you this morning, because even as death is the last enemy that is overcome, Paul says, and death and Hades are going to be thrown into the lake of fire as well, here the greatest adversary of Christians that has pursued them with great rage because he knows his time is short, here when his short time is over, without a battle, he is seized and bound in the pit. And so, once again, a reminder that although Peter says that the devil is like a roaring lion, roaming throughout the earth, seeking whom he may devour. So there is fear when we think of that image. There's anxiety, thinking of the devil trying to come after us. But the good news in 1 John chapter 4 is that greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. And what I see here in Revelation 20, verses 1 to 3, is that when Satan's short time is up, and it's now time for him to be bound, there is nothing that he can do about it. One angel comes with a key and a chain, throws him into the pit, shuts it, and seals it over him. So there's a finality here, or completeness, to what is happening with this binding of Satan. But we're also told, or into verse 3, that he must be, after 1,000 years, released. A couple of things to say here about this imagery. The 1,000 years, there's debate about whether this number should be taken literally or symbolically. And the way I'd respond to that would be to say, I think it could be a literal number, but based on the way that numbers are typically used in Revelation, it's very likely a symbolic number for a long period of time. So in other words, it doesn't have to be 1,000 years as opposed to 999 years or 1,001 years, exactly 1,000, but it can stand for a long period of time that the millennial kingdom is in existence. And so that's, I think I'm comfortable with taking the imagery that way, although it doesn't mean it couldn't be exactly 1,000 years. And then this binding of Satan is one reason why I struggle with an amillennial interpretation of the eschatology, because as we're going to be reminded here in just a couple of minutes, the amillennialist would see this 1,000-year period, which they take as a symbolic number as well, as happening during the church age, or during the time period from the first coming of Jesus in the first century through the final return of Jesus in the second coming. And so from that perspective, Satan is bound at the cross when Jesus triumphs over him at the cross and the resurrection and the ascension. And I do agree, as I hope you remember from our discussion back in Revelation 12, I do agree of the important decisive victory that was accomplished at the cross. Remember that in Revelation 12:11, the way that the saints overcome the dragon is by, first of all, the blood of the Lamb. The fact that Jesus on the cross has already struck the death blow. Already Genesis 3:15, with that proclamation that there would be enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, and that in the end, although the serpent would bruise his heel, he would bruise the head of the serpent. That happens at the cross. And so after that, it's just a matter of waiting for the final cleanup operation of the second coming when everything is dealt with. And then, of course, of this millennial period and the final judgment. So the reminder here is that although Satan is a ferocious foe, he is already defeated, and he knows it. And he's fighting desperately, using his two major weapons of deception and death against the saints. But they can overcome him because of what Jesus has already done. Jesus has already overcome him. And the saints can join in that victory that Jesus has brought through their own faithful testimony with their lips and their lives to what Jesus has testified to, Revelation 12:11. And finally, that they are willing to seal that testimony with their own blood, even as Jesus Christ sealed his testimony with his own blood. If we are willing to do that, friends, if we take advantage of the victory provided by the blood of Jesus Christ, and we are willing to testify to Jesus Christ with our lips and our lives, and do it to the very point of death if necessary, then there is absolutely nothing that the dragon can do to overcome us. That roaring lion is muzzled, so to speak. The dragon is defanged, because in the end, it's the one on the white horse. He is the lion of the tribe of Judah. He is the one before whom every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. All that the dragon is a pretender, a counterfeit, a parody, who has a temporary time to oppress the saints, and then it's all over. He can temporarily nakao them in chapter 11, verse 7, where he conquers the two witnesses, but then they are resurrected and ascended. And then finally, when the dragon is conquered, it is eternal. And so hopefully this puts into perspective our own battle with temptation. Yes, temptation is strong, but remember what James says in chapter 1. Blessed is the man who endures temptation. For when he is tried, after that period, if he is faithfully enduring, he will receive a crown of life. And that is what Jesus promises. He promises a crown of life in Revelation, the 7 churches. And if we are persevering in our victory over Satan, we will receive that. So we go in, and as I said earlier, one of the problems I have with amillennialism is they see this binding of Satan taking place in the church age. And one of the responses that someone has said is that if that's the case, then Satan apparently has a pretty long chain because he still seems to be trying to tempt and deceive the church. The response to that is, well, from the amillennialist perspective, that he is hampered in what he's trying to do. He's not deceiving the nations in the same way that he could before. He's limited by what the cross of Christ has accomplished. And I want to be careful here not to be dismissive of other millennial viewpoints. And if you ever hear a Bible teacher or prophecy teacher who is talking about the book of Revelation, who is talking about eschatology, and you come away with the impression that that person's view is the only view that makes any sense of the data, and everyone else who takes an opposite interpretation must be ignorant or unlearned, you need to have a red flag go up in your thinking. You need to have a little a caution light flash on, because there are several views of Revelation and several views of the data in eschatology which can make sense and which godly people who have studied this book for years hold. And so if a Bible teacher or prophecy teacher makes it sound like his or her view is the only one that has any credibility, then you need to be careful about what that person says and how you listen to them, because they're either not aware of other views, which means that they're not able to give a balanced view of the book of Revelation and prophecy, or they're aware of them and they're not being completely honest and forthright about weaknesses in their own view and strengths in the other view, and you have to be careful of that. So I would caution us that that happens frequently in many things with biblical studies and theology, but especially in the book of Revelation and in eschatology. So as we look at this passage and the binding of Satan, this is one of the reasons why I don't think amillennial viewpoint, where there's a spiritual reign of Christ in heaven and the saints in heaven with Christ, and the millennial period is going on during this time period of the church age, I don't think that really is a capturing the force of the imagery here, which to me seems to be a total binding of Satan and this restricting of him to the pit during this 1,000-year millennial period when Christ is reigning on planet Earth. Going on to the next part of the passage, we get to chapter 20, verse 4. In this verse, John says, "Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded." And notice that they had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God. So multiple times throughout the book, we've seen these two concepts paired together: the testimony of Jesus and the word of God. And that is the reason why these souls have been beheaded, because they have been involved in witnessing to the testimony of Jesus and to the word of God. And those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their forehead or their hands. So the people that John sees now on these thrones, who are reigning and ruling with Christ during the millennial period, are those to whom authority to judge was committed. And this harkens back to earlier places in the New Testament and 1 Corinthians, where Paul talks about the saints having a role in judgment. It goes back into the Gospels, where Jesus talks to the disciples about thrones, about them reigning and ruling and having judgment over Israel. And it comes back in the book of Revelation to the promises to the overcomers in the seven churches, that they will have the ability to reign with Christ. So there's multiple places throughout both earlier scriptures and also the book of Revelation itself where we can see the idea of this reigning and ruling. And here in chapter 20, verse 4, there is a fulfillment of that, but the final fulfillment of that will not come until the new heavens and new earth. Later in when we get to chapters 21 and 22 on Thursday, we'll see another reference to the saints reigning and ruling with Christ. And that will be the final reigning and ruling that happens in the new heavens and new earth. But here, the people who can participate in that are these who have been beheaded. And so the question is, are these only the martyrs, or do these refer to all the Christians who have been faithful to Christ throughout the centuries up to this point? I tend to take this more generally, not as only being restricted to those who were actually physically martyred, but those who were faithful. In this language of not worshiping the beast, not receiving its mark on the foreheads or their hands, reinforces that faithful witness that they have carried out. Notice now that at the end of verse 4, they came to life. and they reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. There's another reference to that period of time. So there's a big debate over this idea of what it means to say they came to life, as they saw, that Greek term there. And it refers, throughout the other occurrences of it that we have, it seems to refer to a physical resurrection, to coming to physical life. But people who are not premillennial, amillennialists, they will want to interpret this as a spiritual coming to life, to say that this refers to when people are dead in trespasses and sins, as Ephesians 2 says in 1-3, and then Ephesians 2 verse 4, but God, who is rich in mercy, has made us alive together in Christ. And clearly, it does refer to this idea of coming to life spiritually. That is there in Scripture. But this verb that is used in chapter 20, verse 4, is not the verb that is used in those other places. It's the verb that is used talking about people who come to physical life. And so if this is referring to spiritual resurrection, then it would be one of the only, or maybe the only places that this Greek verb would be used in this way. Now, that doesn't mean it has to mean physical life, but I do think it's part of the strength of the premillennial interpretation of this passage to argue that this resurrection is not a spiritual resurrection, but it is a physical resurrection where people who had died now come to life and reign with Christ for this 1,000-year period. We're going to, in a moment, say a little bit more about the differences between the resurrections and the death, and the kinds of death. But notice in verses 5 and 6, that there are the rest of the dead. They did not come to life. So these people who are reigning and ruling with Christ during the millennial period, they did come to life and then reigned. The rest of the dead did not come to life until this 1,000-year period was ended. So this part of verse 5 is kind of a parenthetical statement addressing the others who are not included in this group. And I see this as referring to the unrighteous. If the righteous are resurrected at the beginning of the millennial period and reign with Christ, the rest of the dead do not come to life until afterwards, and they would come to life after the millennial period. There would be a resurrection where they would then be judged, which we'll see in a moment. But these people who come to life before the 1,000-year period begins and reign with Christ, this is the first resurrection. And I'm suggesting to us that this first resurrection is not a spiritual resurrection of those who are becoming Christians or becoming saints, but it's a physical resurrection of people who are saints who have died coming to life physically. And then notice in verse 6 this beatitude that is giving. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. So we have a first resurrection, and if you share in that, you are blessed and holy, and over such the second death has no power. But they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. There's another reference to the 1,000-year period. Notice how many times here in chapter 20, verses 1-6, this 1,000-year period is mentioned. It's not mentioned other places in Scripture, but here in Revelation 20, it's a major part of this vision that John is describing for us. So we've been talking about the first resurrection, the second death. On the next screen, I want to show a slide which hopefully will make these a little bit clearer for us. The way that I read this passage in Revelation chapter 20, in light of the rest of Scripture and the rest of the Revelation, the first death is that physical death that everyone experiences except for those alive at the second coming. So in Revelation 19, we have a picture of the second coming with Christ coming back on the white horse. But in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul describes in more detail the relationship of those who have already died and those who are alive to the second coming. He says, and by the way, the church at Thessalonica, this is one of the very first letters that Paul writes. And so there's a concern early on that those who have come to Christ and who have died, what is going to happen to them? So what happens is that the believers in Thessalonica perhaps have a family member, maybe a grandmother, who they're all waiting for Christ to return. They believe he's coming back soon, but then grandma dies. And the question is, well, what about grandma? Christ is going to come back, and the rest of us are going to go be with him, but grandma's already dead. She's going to miss out. She's going to be, if I can use this term, left behind. And the response from Paul is, no, actually, grandma gets a place of priority in this whole thing, because when Christ returns, when the trump sounds, when there's the cry of the archangel and Christ comes, all the dead in Christ, those who have already died in right relationship to God, they will rise first. So grandma will rise first and go up into the air, and then we who are alive and remain on the earth, we will be caught up together with them in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4. So he addresses their concern about their misunderstanding about eschatology and the return of Christ. And when I see first death, the first death is that physical death that everyone experiences, except those who are alive at the second coming, as Paul describes. They will not be resurrected. They will not have to be resurrected because they didn't die. They will be the only people who did not experience the first death, the physical death, because they were born, and then during their lifetime, Jesus returned and caught them up to be with him. So that first death is physical death. The second death is being cast into the lake of fire. And in verse 14, as we'll see here at the end of our time today, there's a specific reference to those who are cast into the lake of fire. It is the second death. The first resurrection, here in chapter 20, verses 3 and 4 that we've been looking at, that is the righteous who are resurrected before the millennial period. And the second resurrection are the unrighteous after the millennial period. So on this reading of the imagery, the righteous are resurrected before the millennial period and they reign with Christ. The rest of the dead, who would be the unrighteous, they are not resurrected until after the millennium. And there may be some who interpret this imagery specifically about martyrs in Revelation 20, 3 and 4, and then they may say that the rest of the dead would include those who aren't martyrs, who aren't part of that group that are resurrected. That would be another way of interpreting the imagery, but I would feel it makes more sense to take those reigning with Christ in the millennial period as referring to all the saints, not just a certain class of saints who have been martyred. All of the saints have to be willing to be martyred and ready to be martyred if necessary, even though not every single one of them will be or have been. Now, here are a few reasons from Alan F. Johnson on why the millennium. And Osborne gets into some of this in his commentary. Alan Johnson has written the commentary in the Expositor's Bible Commentary Revised Edition and published by Zondervan. And I would recommend that commentary to you. It's a whole series of commentaries on the entire Bible. There's 13 of them. And if you're going to buy them, try to get the revised editions, which came out in the 2000s. There's an earlier set, which is still a good set, from the 1970s and 80s, I believe, but the revised set has been updated. But the revised set in the last volume on Revelation, there's only about 211 pages to read, and Johnson does a great job. As a matter of fact, I use that commentary for my on-campus class when I teach through Daniel Revelation. So I would recommend that to you as well. And he gives 4 reasons for why the millennium is important. Because I think if we're honest, I know there's been times in my mind I've struggled with this thought. Why do we even need a millennial period? If Jesus has returned and dealt a decisive blow to sin and evil and conquered the Antichrist and conquered the false beast and all the armies, why do we have to wait around for 1,000 years with Jesus reigning here on planet Earth before we go on into the new heavens and new earth? Let's just have the final judgment. Let's go right in the new heavens and new earth, which is going to be the ultimate experience that any of us have ever imagined, and let's just live there for the rest of eternity. Why do we need a physical reign of Christ on planet Earth for 1,000 years before the final new heavens and new earth? And that is a legitimate question, and I can understand why people wrestle with that question, and it might make them think that amillennialism or other viewpoints, other forms of premillennialism make more sense to them than this view of a physical reign of Christ on earth. But here are 4 reasons from Alan Johnson why this view might be important. And the first one is that during the millennium, that Christ will openly manifest his kingdom in world history. So the idea is, in the new heavens and new earth, all this has come to an end, our current situation, our current world history. But here in the millennial period, although it's different, it's transformed because Jesus is now here physically and present, it's still the current planet Earth, and there's still some of the aspects remaining that we have in our time. And so we're not in the new heavens and new earth yet. So this would give Christ the open manifestation of his kingdom in world history. It will be an actual demonstration of the truthfulness of the divine witness borne by Christ and his followers during their life on earth. and it will be a time of the fulfillment of all God's promises, covenant promises to his people. And here's where premillennialists sometimes bring in the Old Testament prophecies about what God is going to do for Israel, what God is going to do for this earth, and some of the restoration and all of this. And many people see those promises as being fulfilled in a millennial period here on planet Earth. Although, to be fair to other positions, I think you could also read many of those Old Testament prophecies as being about the final new heavens and new earth. In other words, you don't have to take it as only being about the millennial period. It could be extended into the final new heavens and new earth. You can read that in both ways. So even though I think that this is the right interpretation of a 1,000-year millennial reign on planet Earth, I do see how others take that differently. Number two, the millennium, and I think this is a key point, the millennium will reveal that humanity's rebellion against God lies deep in the human heart, not in the devil's deception, or could we say not only in the devil's deception. So in other words, there is human depravity here, that when the humans have turned against God and rebelled, they have, as Isaiah says in chapter 53, verse 6, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned all of us to our own way. And that deep-seated human depravity is at the heart of the problem of the human condition. Yes, there is temptation from Satan that humans follow and that they are influenced by. But there's an inherited depravity that is within us, a total depravity. And yes, Wesleyan Arminians do believe in total depravity. We believe in God's prevenient grace that awakens us and enables us to respond to God's grace. But apart from God's grace, all of us are in a fallen condition from which we cannot recover. We must have God's help to do that. And thankfully, he offers us grace that we can cooperate with, has grace, and be restored to fellowship. But this millennium shows us that even when Satan is bound and righteousness prevails in the world, some people will still rebel against God. The final release of Satan will openly draw out this hidden evil. And as Osborne says, even after living for the equivalent of 14 lifetimes, if you take a 70-year lifetime, multiply by 14, you get to just under 1,000 years. And so what happens is these people who have lived on planet Earth for all of these years under the righteous reign of the perfect ruler, Jesus Christ, still within their hearts is, if they haven't submitted themselves to his lordship fully, they still have the capacity to rebel and to reject him. And when Satan reappears on the scene, these people are ready and waiting. It's almost as if they are waiting for the return of Satan so they can turn away from Christ and follow him again into the final lake of fire. And so I would just remind us, friends, that Revelation is a portrayal of what is within humanity's heart. It's God's sovereignty, but also human responsibility. And if you are not following the Lamb right now, if you are rejecting his leadership in your life in any way and turning to your own way, the scary thing is this seed of human depravity is bearing fruit and nourishing within your own heart. And so I urge you, allow this picture of what is going to happen in the millennial period to remind you of how important it is to continually follow Christ with no reservations. Because if you don't, you have created a place within yourself that is open to Satan's deception. And when he offers that temptation to rebel, there's going to be something within you that's going to respond to that. That's why it's important to be living a life that is saved, entirely sanctified, and walking in all the light. And if you are following the Lamb wherever he goes, there is nothing that Satan can do to deceive you and destroy you as long as you keep following the Lamb. But if you are not walking in the light, if your heart has not been surrendered to him completely, then there is going to be a pull against God. There's going to be an openness to deception, to temptation that you don't want to have to deal with. So I urge you now, go all in following the Lamb. Don't leave room for the evil one to come and pull you aside. And number 3 and 4, the release of Satan after the millennium shows the invulnerability of the city of God and the extent of the authority of Christ, since the devil is immediately defeated and thrown into the lake of fire. So even though there is the permission or the allowing of the devil to have a time period, after the 1,000 years, a brief time of deception and rebellion, it is immediately put down. And we're going to see that in just a few minutes here when we get to the end of the book. So when we go down to number 4, The millennium will serve as a long period required to do the general house cleaning needed after the preceding ages of sin, during which sin was prevalent. And this may be one of the less persuasive of the four reasons that Johnson has, but still it's something to think about. What are the impacts of sin on this world, and what would it take to clean that up and for there to be righteous living? One other point I want to make here, this is from Jim Hamilton, who is a New Testament and biblical theology professor at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Hamilton has actually written a nice commentary and revelation of expository sermons that he preached on the book. He's a premillennial futurist interpreter. But what he has pointed out is the typology or the correspondences between Adam in the book of Genesis and Jesus. This is what Paul talks about in Romans 5, where he makes a comparison between the first Adam and the second Adam. And just as in the first Adam situation, God gave him a beautiful Garden of Eden, and Adam was God's representative in the garden. He was ruling over that as the steward. And when the serpent came into that beautiful garden, all that Adam had to do, and Adam and Eve together, remained faithful to the commands of God to not eat that fruit. Instead, when the serpent came, they rejected God's command and they ate the fruit and they fell and sin entered the world. So Hamilton's point is that one thing the millennium does is the millennium shows how the second Adam comes. And he also is reigning and ruling over planet Earth, over in something like the Garden of Eden. Now, it's not exactly the Garden of Eden from the book of Genesis, but it's this planet Earth where there's righteousness, where he is reigning. And when Satan comes into that after the millennial period and tries to bring deception and destruction, the second Adam conquers him and overcomes him. So even as the first Adam failed in the original Garden of Eden, and Satan conquered and brought deception and destruction, the second Adam in this time period of the millennial reign will not fail. He will be faithful, he will be true, and he will finally overcome the Satan's final gasp of deception and destruction. So that from Hamilton is another reason why he sees a purpose of the millennial period. So this is the chronological sequence of events as I see them here in the end times. We have the parousia, the Greek word for the coming of Christ, which is the second coming. Then we have the defeat of Antichrist. That happens at the Battle of Armageddon and Christ's second coming. Then the binding of Satan that we've seen here in Revelation 20, verses 1 to 3. Then the first resurrection in Revelation 23 and 4. Then it is followed by the millennial period, the 1,000 years. Then the release of Satan, which we're getting ready to look at in chapter 20, verse 7. Followed by the second resurrection of the unrighteous dead and the final judgment, and then followed by the new heaven and new earth in 21 and 22. So with that in mind, let's say a little bit more about views of the millennium. This is a review from the very first session that we did 8 weeks ago now, I guess it's been, and back at the beginning of April when we started our Bible study. The very first video has this in more detail, but this is a book edited by Darrell Bock, with contributions from proponents of premillennialism, Craig Blasing, postmillennialism, Kenneth Gentry, and amillennialism, Robert Strimple. So I would recommend this book to you for more in-depth discussion of what we are briefly overviewing this morning. And this is another pamphlet I mentioned before, The Four Views of the End Times, and the charts that follow I've pulled out of this pamphlet for us to illustrate these three different viewpoints. Also, I'm drawing from the ESV Study Bible Introduction to Revelation, which I made available to you in the free resources document on Revelation. So again, I want to quickly review the three views of the millennium with you before we finish chapter 20. The dispensational or pre-tribulational premillennialism. Normally it's associated with a futurist approach to the book. In this view, Jesus returns pre or before the 1,000 years, which are the millennium, which is followed by the new heavens and the new earth. The ESV Study Bible definition, pre-tribulational premillennialism expects a future 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, but the part that makes it pre-tribulational and dispensational is that dispensationalism is a larger system, but dispensationalism typically takes this pre-tribulational view, and that is that Christ comes first secretly in a secret rapture to take believers from the earth before a great tribulation period of 7 years. After the tribulation, Christ comes back publicly to reign on the earth, and that he brings his believers back with him at that time. And as we said last time, that is that two-stage view of Christ's return. And the graphic here, you see God working with Israel before Calvary in the dispensational viewpoint, and then he working with the church in a different way after the cross. And then we have the rapture pre-tribulation. Some are mid-tribulation. We talked about that a little bit. And then the second coming, the return of Christ, the millennial period, followed by the final judgment and eternity. So that is one of the two major varieties of premillennialism is the dispensational or pre-tribulational view. The other variety is the classic or historical premillennial view. Again, normally associated with a futurist approach. Again, very similarly, Jesus returns before the 1,000 years, the millennium, which is followed by the new heavens and new earth. The difference, though, is that classical premillennialism expects a future 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth with both believers and unbelievers present prior to the final judgment. Therefore, it expects that Christ will come back before the millennium. It also expects that believers will go through a time of great tribulation. So rather than there being a two-stage return of Christ with a secret rapture, followed by 7 years, followed by the final stage of his return, there is one stage of Christ's return. And I'll show you on the next screen here the way that this is conceptualized as a graphic. You have the church age, society grows increasingly evil. Then at some point the Great Tribulation period starts. That 42-month time times in half a time, 3.5-year period that is referred to multiple times, 1,260 days in the book of Daniel and in the book of Revelation. Then you have the second coming of Christ, where there is a rapture, but the way the rapture works is saints go up, and 1 Thessalonians 4 describes, and then they come right back down, as Revelation 19 describes, where we have the final battle. So there's not a 7-year period separating the two stages. It is one stage in this way of looking at it. And then there's the millennial period and eternity. Just real quick before I forget, one question that comes up sometimes is, where do the people who go into the millennial period come from? Well, of course, if there's a resurrection of the righteous, then that would be one way that they come, the people in the millennial period. But a second question is, are there unbelievers in the millennial period? And if you believe that all of humanity is rebelling against God and destroyed together at the great supper of God at the return of Christ in Revelation 19, then the only way that you could have unbelievers in the millennial period if they were not resurrected, and it says that they are not resurrected until after the millennial period of the great judgment, would be that the children of those who are born during the millennial period for that 1,000-year time, that some of those children would then choose to rebel against God when Satan comes back. So then you would have people who are not fully following Christ or who turn from Christ when Satan returns from the pit. Another viewpoint is that not all of the unbelievers were killed at the great battle of Armageddon. Only those who joined the army of the beast are killed, but other unbelievers on planet Earth who were not part of that great army could have survived the Armageddon because they weren't part of that battle, and then they could have continued on into the millennial period with Christ reigning and ruling, still being unbelievers. So those are some of the tricky questions that have to be answered by those who believe in the millennial period, and they're not completely spelled out in Scripture, so we don't always know 100% which way to go on some of those questions, but those are some suggestions for how to handle that idea of people living throughout the millennial period. Now we come to two other major systems, amillennialism and postmillennialism. The amill view is usually associated with an idealist approach to Revelation, but also compatible with some historicist and preterist approaches to the book. This is the view that there is no future millennium between the present church age and the future new heavens and new earth. As the ESV defines it, the 1,000-year vision prepares the church for a long era of witness and suffering between Christ's first coming to bind Satan and his return to destroy Satan. So the dragon is already a defeated foe. He cannot thwart God's plan to gather people from all nations into the Lamb's redeemed army. That after the binding of Satan at the cross in the first century and the resurrection, that is when the millennial period is going on. Spiritually, Christ is reigning and ruling in heaven with the saints, and finally he returns to the earth. The graph for this, you can see how here Satan's power is restrained at the cross. Then the millennial period is going on in heaven with Jesus ruling and the saints ruling, while the church age is going on here on earth and the tribulation period is going on. And some amillennialists, perhaps many of them, would also see an intensification of persecution and tribulation at the end before the final second coming of Christ and final judgment. So in premillennialism, Christ comes back before the millennial period, but in amillennial and postmillennial views, he comes back at the end of the millennial period, with the major view between and post being that in amillennialism, the reign of Christ is going on in heaven. In postmillennialism, the church is reigning on earth as they get closer and closer to the final return of Christ. Now we'll finish by looking at the postmill view, and then we'll finish the text of Revelation 20. Postmillennialism, often associated with a preterist approach, also compatible with historicist approach. Jesus returns after the 1,000 years. ESV definition says that the 1,000 years is still a future time. It's a wonderful coming age in which the gospel will triumph so greatly as to thoroughly transform the world's societies and cultures. During the millennium, Christ is in heaven, as he is in the amillennial view, and he's not on earth, but he exercises his reign on earth through his Spirit and the church's preaching of the gospel. And this is conceptualized here in the chart as the church age, which at some point, there's a tribulation period, but then at some point, instead of society gradually getting worse, society is gradually improving until finally we go into the millennial period as politicians and leaders become Christians and righteousness begins to reign more and more on the earth. And finally, at the end of all of that, we have the final second coming of Christ and judgment and eternity. Now, throughout this course, I've been following a premillennial approach to the book, which I think makes the best sense of the data. But I do want to be fair to both amill and postmill interpreters and acknowledge the strengths that they have in some of their interpretations. And the postmillennial interpretation of Scripture was very much a part of the Wesleyan holiness heritage from the Methodist theologians and historians of the 1700s into the 1800s. And as with much of Christianity in that time period, postmillennialism was very influential. Amillennialism has been very influential from the time of Augustine down throughout church history. So for that 1,000 years or so, from Augustine to the Reformers, amillennial approaches predominated. But premillennialism, in the historical classical sense, is seen as being the position that the first century interpreters, the early church in at the end of the first century into the second century, would have interpreted up to Augustine. And then it came back in prominence in more recent times. So it has been around for the whole period of interpretation. And I think amillennial and postmillennial have a lot of good points that need to be taken seriously. But at the end of the day, I find the premillennial approach most convincing. But now let's move on to a couple of things that hopefully we can agree on no matter what our take on the millennial system is. When that 1,000-year period, when it comes to an end, Satan will be released from his prison and he will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth. And I take four corners here as a reference to the universal aspect of where he is reaching. The four corners, he's reaching out in deception everywhere he can. Gog and Magog is a fascinating reference that comes out of the book of Ezekiel. And Osborne says more about this in his commentary. But apparently, the nations of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel provide a background here to these nations that are going to rebel against Jesus at the end of this millennial period when Satan comes back. And so Gog and Magog, he gathers them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. So that language emphasizing the great amount of people who are rebelling against Christ in this final rebellion. There is, in the gathering them for battle, this reminds us the same language is used in Revelation 16, gathering for the battle of Armageddon. Some amillennialists would point to this language and say, well, this actually means that this is the same battle, the battle of Armageddon in chapter 16, the final rebellion of Satan in chapter 20. I would disagree. I think Osborne's point is this phrase, gather them for battle, is about the only thing that these two battles have in common. If you look at the narrative details, there's actually two separate events, one before the millennium, one after. But here's the point. They marched up over the broad plain of the earth, and they surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. apparently a reference to Jerusalem. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. So again, we see, even as the battle earlier against the Antichrist and the false beast, when Jesus returned and immediately destroyed them, and there was the great supper of God and the lake of fire, here, as even though there's a great host, a multitude rebelling against Christ and coming against the saints in the beloved city, immediately fire comes down from heaven and they are consumed. And now we have, in verse 10, the final downfall of Satan. Now, the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. And now the unholy anti-Trinity are united again in not in battle against God, but in eternal judgment forever and ever. And as we're going to see, all of their followers will also be with them, united forever and ever in the lake of fire. So again, the encouraging truth for us this morning, friends, is if we read the back of the book, of the back of the Bible, which we're doing together through this Bible study, we see that in the end, Jesus wins. God is victorious over every foe, including the dragon, including the false beast, including the Antichrist, the first beast from the sea, the false prophet, the second beast from the land, and all that has opposed God is now done away with. And now there's a final judgment before this chapter is over. Then I saw, notice this language of progression in the narrative, then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. This takes us back to Revelation chapter 4, reminds us of that throne imagery there from the throne room of the universe. Now we see this great white throne. We see the one seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. This reminds us of Revelation chapter 6, at the end of that chapter where we have the sixth seal and the shaking of heavens and earth and the wrath of the Lamb and everyone fleeing in terror, trying to hide from the judgment that is coming. And then John says, I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. So now no one is going to escape from this final judgment. These that are resurrected come before God. And what Osborne sees here, just as back in chapter 14, remember chapter 14 talked about two harvests. There was the harvest of the earth, the grain harvest, and the harvest of the grapes. And he sees the grain harvest as referring to the righteous, the saints, that Jesus comes and he harvests them, takes them, and then he sees that the angel comes in judgment and harvests the unrighteous, the grapes. So he sees, Osborne sees in chapter 14, both a harvest of the righteous and a harvest of the unrighteous. Here in chapter 20, he sees in verse 12 a judgment of the saints, that the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, the books are opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. He sees a reference to Christians here, and then in verse and the dead here are judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done. And then in verse 13, we have the sea giving up the dead who were in it, and we have death and Hades giving up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. So the according to what they have done occurs twice. It occurs here in verse 12 and in verse 13. If Osborne is right that the first judgment here, the first aspect of the judgment in verse 12 is of Christians, the righteous, there is a judgment for them. They are in the book of life, and they are judged according to what they have done. And then in verse 13, all the dead who are in the sea and who are in death and Hades are also brought before the throne, and they are judged according to what they have done. Now, whether you think with Osborne that there is a reference here to the judgment of both the righteous and the unrighteous, or as many people take this passage, you think that this is all just judgment of the unrighteous, because the righteous have already been resurrected before the millennial period. The point is this: all of us will one day stand before God. Every single person listening to this Bible study right now on Facebook or YouTube or watching a video later, including myself, all of us will one day stand before the judge of all the earth. And we will look into those eyes that are as a flame of fire, and we will hear his verdict. If we have followed him, if we have followed the Lamb wherever he goes, if we have been faithful and the blood of Jesus Christ has cleansed our sins, then we will rejoice as we hear him say, Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joys that have been prepared for you. And I cannot think of another single thing I would rather hear than on that day to hear those words and to be in his presence forever. But the sad reality is that those who have rejected the offer of the gospel, those who have turned away from the Lamb, who have followed the beast instead, who have not given their allegiance to God who sits on the throne, they will hear him say, "Depart from me, you workers of unrighteousness," and they will be cast out of his presence forever. The place that they will go is into the place that was prepared for the unholy anti-Trinity. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he also was thrown into that lake of fire. And so, friends, as we close this morning, let me, as I did yesterday when I closed the session, as I did last week on Revelation 19, urging you to make sure that you were ready for that second coming of Christ. I would close again on this note of this final judgment by saying, if your name is not written in the Lamb's Book of Life, it can be. You do not have to go through the rest of this day and the rest of your life with that uncertainty. And if you don't know for a fact that your sins have been forgiven, that you have asked Jesus Christ into your life, and that you have pledged yourself to follow the Lamb wherever he goes, then I would love this morning, if as we close, that you would ask him to do that for you. And that when this day of judgment comes, it will not be a day that you dread. It will not be the most horrific moment you could ever imagine, but instead, it will be a day of great glory and a day of great triumph, because you have finally seen the thing that you've lived for, and that is you've seen the coming of Christ, you've seen the reign of Christ, and you've seen the final judgment followed by the new heavens and new earth. We're going to be going into a wonderful description of the new heavens and new earth next time on Thursday for our final session, but I urge you to prepare for that by making sure that your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life. And it can be if you ask him to write it there. And if you haven't done that, please take a moment to pray and do that now. Thank you so much for being with us as we work through this chapter 20 and all the interpretive questions. I hope that the overall theological message of what Revelation 20 is saying has come through, despite how you might take the individual interpretive issues of these verses, which admittedly are difficult. The main point, of course, is that he will reign and all knees will bow before him. And even in a final rebellion by Satan against him, that will not be successful, because no one can stand against the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Thanks again, and Lord willing, we'll see you on Thursday.